The screaming begins before dawn. You're 17 years old, and you've been digging graves for 3 years now. Your hands are permanently stained with the clay and rots of countless burials, your back bent from the endless hours of scraping earth with tools that were already ancient when your grandfather was young. The smell of death clings to your clothes, your skin, your very soul, but the smell is the least of your horrors. You wake in the cramped hut you share with 6 other gravediggers, all of you outcasts from the village proper. The walls are thin wood planks that barely keep out the wind, and the roof leaks when it rains. There's no fire this morning because there's no wood. There's no food because there's no money, and there's no hope because there never is. The bell tolls from the church tower, 3 deep notes that make your stomach clench with dread. 3 tolls means plague. 3 tolls means bodies. 3 tolls means another day of hell that stretches before you like an open grave. You pull on your boots, the leather cracked and stiff with dried mud and worse things. The other men are stirring, groaning as they wake to the same nightmare you've all been living. Marcus, who's been doing this work for 15 years, coughs up blood into his palm and wipes it on his pants without comment. The lung rot is taking him, same as it took the last 3 men who slept in his corner of the hut. Outside, the village is already stirring with the frantic energy of the damned. People hurry past with cloths pressed to their faces, eyes wide with terror. They won't look at you directly, because you're one of the gravediggers, one of the cursed ones who handles the dead. In their minds, you're already contaminated, already lost, a walking corpse who just hasn't had the courtesy to lie down yet. The priest meets you at the churchyard gate, his face pale in the morning light. Father Benedict is a good man, one of the few who still treats you with something approaching human dignity. But even he keeps his distance, blessing you from 6 feet away, as if proximity might steal his soul. God's work awaits, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. The Whitmore family, all 7 of them. 7 bodies? A whole family wiped out in 3 days. You've seen it before, we'll see it again. The plague doesn't discriminate, doesn't care about prayers or piety, or the desperate bargains people make with God in their final moments. It takes children and grandparents, pregnant mothers, and strong young men. It takes everyone. You walk to the Whitmore cottage with the other diggers, your shovels balanced on your shoulders like the grim weapons they've become. The house stands silent, door hanging open, like a mouth frozen in a scream. No smoke rises from the chimney. No animals move in the yard. Death has swept through here, like a black wind, leaving only silence and the sweet, sickening smell of decay. Inside, the bodies wait. They've been dead for 2 days, bloated and discoloured, their faces twisted into expressions of agony that will haunt your dreams. Little Sarah Whitmore, only 6 years old, lies curled in her mother's arms. Her blonde hair is matted with sweat and blood, her small body already beginning to swell with the gases of decomposition. This is what breaks you every time. Not the adults who've had their chance at life, but the children. The babies who never learned to walk, never spoke their first words, never felt the sun on their faces without the shadow of death hanging over them. You've buried hundreds of children, and each one tears another piece from your soul. The work of moving the bodies is nightmarish. They're heavy with death, awkward and slippery in your hands. The smell hits you like a physical blow, so strong you have to fight not to vomit. Your eyes water, your throat burns, and still you carry them out one by one, loading them onto the cart like cordwood. Margaret Whitmore, the grandmother, comes apart in your hands. The skin slips away from the muscle like a wet glove, and her arm separates from her torso with a wet, tearing sound. You've seen this before, but it never gets easier. You gather the pieces as best you can, wrapping them in the stained cloth that serves as a shroud. The cart lurches and bounces over the rutted road to the burial ground, each jolt sending the bodies sliding against each other, with sounds you'll never forget. The wheels stick in the mud, and you have to push while the others pull, your feet slipping in the mire that's composed of equal parts earth and human remains. The graveyard is a wasteland of churned earth and crooked wooden crosses. There's no grass here anymore, just mud and bones, and the occasional rat scurrying between the mounds. You've dug so many graves that the ground is more whole than earth, a honeycomb of death that seems to extend down to the very centre of the world. You begin to dig. The earth is soft here, made rich by the constant addition of human decay. Your shovel slides through the soil with ease, but each scoop releases a fresh wave of stench that makes your head swim. Pieces of previous burials emerge with each shovelful. A child's finger bone, a scrap of burial cloth, a skull that grins up at you with empty sockets. The work is backbreaking. Medieval shovels are crude affairs, little more than a sharpened wood with metal tips. The handles are short, forcing you to bend nearly double with each scoop. Your back screams in protest, but you can't stop. The dead won't bury themselves, and the living won't do it. By midday, you've dug 3 graves. Your hands are blistered and bleeding, your clothes soaked with sweat and worse. The sun beats down mercilessly, cooking the smell of death into the air until it's thick enough to choke on. You drink warm, stale water from a shared skin, trying to wash the taste of decay from your mouth. The other diggers work in grim silence. There's nothing to say that hasn't been said 1,000 times before. Nothing to do but dig and carry and bury. An endless cycle that stretches from dawn to dusk, every day of your cursed existence. Sometimes someone will mutter a prayer, but more often you work in silence, broken only by the sound of shovels biting earth and the distant tolling of church bells marking another death. You lower the first body into its grave. Thomas Whitmore, the father, a man you remember from market days when he sold vegetables and smiled at his children. Now he's just dead weight, his face black with corruption, his body stiff and cold. The rope slips in your hands as you lower him down, and his head strikes the side of the grave with a wet thud. The children go next. This is always the hardest part. Lowering small bodies into dark holes, watching them disappear into the earth that will consume them. Little Sarah's grave is so small, so final. You want to say something, some words of comfort or blessing, but your throat is closed with grief and disgust. The plague victims don't get proper burial rites. There's no time for ceremony, no money for proper coffins, no priest willing to risk contamination by getting too close. You shovel dirt over them quickly, trying to get them covered before the smell attracts more rats. The earth falls on their faces with small pattering sounds, like rain on a roof. As the sun begins to set, you're still digging. The last grave is the hardest because your body's failing, your muscles screaming in protest. Every shovelful feels like it weighs 100 pounds. Your vision blurs with exhaustion and the toxic fumes rising from the disturbed earth. You stumble back to the village as darkness falls, your work clothes stiff with dried sweat and grave dirt. The villagers avoid you even more carefully now, crossing themselves and muttering prayers as you pass. Children hide behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed with terror at the sight of the gravedigger returning from his unholy work. At the tavern, you're not welcome inside. The innkeeper slides a mug of ale across the threshold and quickly retreats, as if proximity to you might bring the plague into his establishment. The ale is weak and sour, but it helps wash the taste of death from your mouth. You drink it standing in the street like a leper, while normal people enjoy warmth and companionship just yards away. Your pay for the day is 3 copper coins, barely enough for bread and a place to sleep. The priest pays you from church funds, but even he won't hand you the money directly. He places it on a stone and steps back, letting you collect it like you're some kind of dangerous animal. The food you can afford is garbage: stale bread, rancid meat, vegetables that are more rot than substance. But you eat it anyway, because you need strength for tomorrow's work. Your body is consuming itself, burning muscle and fat to keep you moving through the endless cycle of death and burial. Sleep is no escape. Your dreams are filled with corpses, with the faces of the dead you've handled, with the sound of dirt falling on lifeless faces. You wake gasping, your blankets soaked with sweat, the smell of the grave still clinging to your nostrils. Sometimes You're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming, if the nightmare ever really ends. The other gravediggers are dying around you. Marcus coughs up more blood each day, his face growing paler and more gaunt. Willem, who's only been doing this work for a year, already shows the signs of the lung rot that kills most men in this profession. The constant exposure to decay, the breathing of poisoned air, the handling of diseased corpses, all take their toll. You've seen gravediggers die in horrible ways. Some succumb to the plague they're constantly exposed to, their bodies swelling and blackening, like the corpses they bury. Others waste away from the lung rot, coughing up pieces of their own lungs until they drown in their own blood. A few simply go mad from the horror of it all, walking into the forest one day and never coming back. The tools of your trade are instruments of torture. The shovels are crude and heavy, designed for digging drainage ditches rather than graves. The ropes you use to lower bodies are rough hemp that cuts into your hands, leaving permanent scars. The cart you use to transport corpses is a rickety affair that breaks down constantly, leaving you to carry bodies by hand. Winter is the worst time. The ground freezes solid, making digging nearly impossible. You have to build fires on the burial sites, letting them burn for hours to thaw the earth enough to break it with your shovel. The smoke from these fires is toxic, filled with the essence of all the bodies that have decomposed in the soil below. When the ground is too frozen to dig, you have to stack bodies in charnel houses, rough wooden structures that barely keep the corpses from wild animals. The smell in these buildings is indescribable, a concentration of death and decay that makes your eyes water and your throat burn. Rats swarm over the bodies and you have to beat them away with sticks while you work. The spring thaw is almost worse than winter. All the bodies that couldn't be buried during the frozen months begin to decompose at once, creating a soup of human remains that seeps into the groundwater and poisons the wells. The stench during spring thaw is so overwhelming that even the other villagers, who normally ignore your suffering, complain about the smell. Your body is breaking down from the constant exposure to disease and toxic conditions. Your teeth are falling out from malnutrition and the constant taste of decay. Your skin is covered in sores that won't heal, infected by the filth you work in daily. Your hair is falling out in patches, and what remains is grey despite your young age. The social isolation is as devastating as the physical hardships. You can't marry because no woman would have a gravedigger. You can't have friends because no one wants to associate with someone who handles the dead. You can't even attend church services because your presence would contaminate the sacred space. Children throw stones at you when you pass, calling you names and making signs to ward off evil. Adults cross themselves and spit when they see you coming. Even other outcasts, beggars and criminals, look down on you because at least their sins are against the living. You sin against the dead, and that's unforgivable. The constant handling of diseased corpses means you're always sick. Your stomach churns constantly from the things you've been exposed to. Your bowels run like water, and you vomit blood more often than you care to admit. Every cut on your hands becomes infected. Every scratch festers in the poisonous environment you work in. You've seen things that would drive most men mad. Bodies so decomposed they fall apart when you touch them. Corpses that move and shift from the gas building up inside them. Graves that seem to breathe as the earth settles over fresh burials. The dead haunt your waking hours as much as your dreams. The plague bodies are the worst. They're swollen and black, their skin slipping off like wet clothing. The smell is indescribable, a mixture of sweet rot and sharp corruption that burns your nostrils and throat. When you move them, they sometimes burst, releasing fluids that stain your clothes and skin. Mass graves are your most dreaded assignment. When the plague hits hard, there's no time for individual burials. You dig enormous pits and fill them with bodies, layer upon layer of human remains. The weight of the corpses on top crushes those below, creating a horrific mixture of bone and flesh and decay. You've lost count of how many bodies you've buried, Hundreds, thousands, they blur together in your memory, a parade of death that never ends. You remember some faces, usually the children, or the particularly horrible deaths, but most fade into the general nightmare of your existence. The other gravediggers don't talk about their past lives. It's too painful to remember what they were before this cursed work claimed them. You were a farmer's son once, but that life seems like a dream now. The boy who helped with harvests and played with village children is gone, replaced by this hollow shell that exists only to serve death. Your family disowned you when you took this work. They couldn't bear the shame of having a gravedigger in the family, couldn't stand the smell that clung to you, couldn't look at the hands that touched the dead. You haven't spoken to them in 3 years, though you sometimes see them at market turning away when you approach. The church tells you this is God's work, that someone must tend to the dead, that your service is holy. But you know better. This isn't holy work, this is punishment, a living hell that consumes everything good in a man and leaves only the shell behind. You're not serving God, you're serving death itself. The graveyard is your kingdom, a realm of bones and rot where you rule over the silent dead. You know every grave, every mound, every marker. You've dug them all, filled them all, blessed them all with your cursed touch. This is your legacy, your monument to a life spent in service to the grave. At night, when the work is done and the village sleeps, you sometimes sit among the graves and wonder if this is all there is. If this is how your story ends, digging holes until your body gives out, then joining the ranks of the dead you've served so faithfully. There's a certain justice in it, a fitting end for someone who spent his life handling corpses. The worst part isn't the smell, or the horror, or the constant exposure to disease. The worst part is knowing that this is forever. There's no retirement from grave digging, no escape from the cycle of death and burial. You'll do this work until it kills you, and then someone else will dig your grave, and the nightmare will continue. You are 17 years old, and you're already dead. Your body still moves, still breathes, still digs graves, but your soul died the first time you lowered a child into the earth. What walks around wearing your face is just an echo, a ghost that serves the endless hunger of the grave. The screaming that woke you this morning wasn't from the village, it was from inside your own head, the sound of whatever humanity remained in you, crying out against the horror of another day spent in service to death. But you've learned to ignore that screaming, to push it down into the dark places where all your feelings go to die. Tomorrow there will be more bodies. There always are. The plague never stops. The old never stop dying. Accidents never stop happening. And you'll be there with your shovel and your cart, ready to carry them to their final rest. Because that's what you are now. That's all you are. You are the gravedigger. You are the servant of death. You are the one who stands between the living and the dead, forever contaminated by both, accepted by neither. And this is your life, stretching out before you like an open grave, dark and deep and without end. The horror isn't in the work itself. The horror is in knowing that tomorrow will be exactly the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the earth finally claims you too. The horror is in the realization that you've become something less than human, something that exists only to serve the endless appetite of the grave. But surviving the endless cycle of digging wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching yourself change, watching pieces of your soul break off and disappear into the same pits you dug daily. By your second year, you no longer flinched when a decomposing hand fell from a shroud. You stopped gagging at the smell of rotting flesh mixed with quicklime. You ceased to feel anything when children's bodies were lowered into graves you'd carved from frozen earth. This numbness crept through you like a disease, deadening not just your revulsion, but your capacity for any feeling at all. The other gravediggers were your only companions in this world of death, but they were hardly sources of comfort. Most had been doing this work for years, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes reflecting the emptiness of the graves they dug. They spoke little, and when they did, it was usually to complain about the aching in their backs or the inadequacy of their tools. There was Marcus, an older man who'd been digging graves for nearly a decade. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and decay, his fingernails black crescents of filth that no amount of scrubbing could clean. He'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a particularly harsh winter, but he continued working because there was nowhere else for him to go. His wife had died of the same plague that kept him employed, and his children had fled to distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with a man who smelled perpetually of death. Then there was Willem, barely older than you, but already showing signs of the lung sickness that claimed most gravediggers eventually. His cough was a constant companion, a wet, rattling sound that echoed through the cemetery in the early morning hours. He'd cough up blood into rags that he'd burn at the end of each day, knowing that the sickness was consuming him from the inside. Yet he continued digging because the alternative was starvation, and at least this way his death would be gradual rather than immediate. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was digging his own grave one shovelful at a time. The cemetery itself became your entire world, a landscape of death that stretched beyond your ability to comprehend. During the height of plague outbreaks, the individual graves gave way to massive pits that could hold dozens of bodies. You'd work for days excavating these communal graves, your muscles screaming in protest as you moved tons of earth. The geometry of death became second nature to you, calculating how many bodies would fit in a given space, how deep to dig to prevent animals from disturbing the remains, how to layer the corpses to maximize efficiency. These calculations haunted your dreams, turning sleep into another form of labor as your mind continued its grim arithmetic, even in unconsciousness. The religious aspects of your work provided no comfort, only additional layers of horror. Priests would arrive to perform hasty blessings over the mass graves, their Latin prayers mixing with the sound of dirt hitting decomposing flesh. But these ceremonies were perfunctory, rushed affairs that seemed to mock the very concept of dignity in death. You watched families weep over graves that contained not just their loved ones, but dozens of strangers, their grief diluted by the impossibility of individual mourning in the face of such overwhelming mortality. The priests themselves often looked terrified, rushing through their rituals and fleeing the cemetery as quickly as possible, leaving you alone with the dead and the dying. Your relationship with the living became increasingly strained as the months passed. People would cross the street to avoid you, covering their faces with cloth as if your very presence could spread disease. Children would point and whisper when you passed, their parents pulling them away while making signs against evil. Shopkeepers would refuse to serve you, claiming that your money was cursed. Even other members of the working class, people who understood poverty and desperation, looked at you with a mixture of pity and revulsion that cut deeper than outright hatred. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of your existence. Human beings are social creatures, but your work had made you untouchable in the most literal sense. You couldn't form friendships because no one wanted to associate with someone who spent his days handling plague victims. You couldn't find romantic companionship because what woman would want to be with a man who smelled of death and decay? You couldn't even maintain relationships with your own family, assuming they were still alive, because your presence put them at risk of both disease and social ostracism. The physical toll of the work was relentless and cumulative. Your hands, once soft and young, became gnarled claws covered in calluses and scars. The repeated lifting of bodies and shoveling of dirt built muscle in your arms and shoulders, but it also compressed your spine and wore down your joints. Your back was a constant source of pain, a dull ache that never fully disappeared and occasionally flared into sharp agony that would drop you to your knees. The cold and dampness of the cemetery seeped into your bones, making every movement a struggle during the winter months. But it was the smaller injuries that truly wore you down. Cuts from rusty shovels that wouldn't heal properly in the unsanitary conditions, splinters from crude coffins that festered under your skin, bruises from handling awkward loads that deepened into permanent discoloration. Your feet, wrapped in rags because proper shoes were beyond your means, developed sores and infections that made every step a reminder of your degraded status. The cumulative effect of these minor wounds was a body that felt like a battlefield, scarred and damaged in ways that would never fully heal. The seasonal changes brought different challenges, but no relief. Summer meant decomposition happened faster, filling the air with stenches so overwhelming that you'd vomit until your stomach was empty, then continue vomiting bile until your throat was raw. The heat also brought flies, clouds of them, that would cover the corpses and transfer disease with every landing. You'd work in this hellish environment for hours, sweat mixing with the bodily fluids of the dead, creating a toxic soup that coated your skin and clothing. Winter brought its own horrors, with frozen ground that had to be broken with pickaxes, bodies that shattered like pottery when handled roughly, and cold so intense that your tears would freeze on your cheeks as you worked. The dreams, when they came, were worse than waking nightmares. You'd dream of hands reaching up from graves, of voices calling your name from beneath the earth, of your own family members appearing among the corpses you handled. Sometimes you'd dream of digging and digging, searching for the bottom of a grave that extended infinitely downward, your shovel striking bone after bone in an endless percussion of death. You'd wake screaming, your throat raw, your body covered in sweat that smelled of grave dirt and decay. Sleep became another form of torture, offering no escape from the horror that had become your life. The question of your own mortality became a constant companion. How long could you continue this work before the diseases you were exposed to claimed you? How long before the physical demands broke your body completely? How long before the psychological pressure drove you to madness? You'd seen other gravediggers succumb to all three fates, their positions quickly filled by new desperate souls who had no other options. The turnover was constant, a revolving door of human misery that ground people up and spat them out with mechanical efficiency. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of your existence was how it changed your relationship with hope itself. Hope, you learned, was a luxury that required the possibility of change, of improvement, of escape. But your work offered none of these things. Each day was identical to the last, an endless repetition of digging and filling, of handling death and breathing disease. The future stretched ahead like an infinite cemetery, filled with graves that you would dig until your own body joined the countless others you'd buried. Hope withered in such conditions, replaced by a grim determination to simply survive another day, then another, until survival itself became meaningless. The social dynamics of the cemetery created their own form of hell. You were at the bottom of even this degraded hierarchy, younger and weaker than the established gravediggers who had their own informal systems of power and control. They would assign you the worst tasks, the most dangerous jobs, the heaviest lifting. If tools went missing, you were blamed. If work wasn't completed on time, you were punished. If religious authorities complained about the state of the graves, you bore the consequences. This internal oppression added another layer of suffering to an already unbearable existence. Your relationship with death itself underwent a profound transformation. What had once been a distant, abstract concept became as familiar as your own heartbeat. You could identify diseases by their smell, estimate how long someone had been dead by the state of decomposition, predict which bodies would be the most difficult to handle based on their positioning in the cart. Death became a technical problem to be solved rather than a human tragedy to be mourned. This clinical detachment was a survival mechanism, but it came at the cost of your own humanity. The economic realities of your situation created a trap from which escape seemed impossible. The wages you earned were barely enough to keep you alive, leaving nothing for savings or investment in a different future. The work itself made you unemployable in other fields, both because of the social stigma and because of the physical and psychological damage it inflicted. You were caught in a cycle where the only way to survive was to continue the work that was slowly killing you, each day buying you life at the cost of your soul. The religious implications of your work haunted you in ways that went beyond simple superstition. In a world where the state of one's soul was considered paramount, what did it mean to spend your days handling the dead? Were you contaminated by constant contact with death? Had your soul been stained by the suffering you witnessed and the desperation that drove you to this work? The priests who performed burial rites treated you with a mixture of pity and fear, as if you were already partially dead yourself, a living ghost who existed in the space between life and death. As your third year in this profession began, you realized that you had become something that wasn't quite human anymore. You moved through the world like a spectre, visible but not truly present, alive but not truly living. The boy who had once laughed and played and dreamed of a future had been buried as surely as any of the corpses you'd lowered into the ground. In his place was something else, something that could function in the world of death but had no place in the world of the living. The cemetery had become your kingdom, a realm of silence and sorrow where you ruled over subjects who would never speak, never rebel, never leave. It was a hollow crown you wore, marking you as sovereign of nothing, master of emptiness, king of the dead. So as we reflect on these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, we must remember that these weren't just historical footnotes, but real human beings whose experiences reveal the true cost of power and exploitation throughout history. The gravediggers of medieval times endured horrors that challenged their very humanity, yet somehow found ways to preserve their dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their stories serve as both a testament to human resilience and a stark reminder that the price of civilization has often been paid by those who had no choice in the transaction. May we honor their memory by ensuring such darkness never again finds fertile ground in our world.